Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience. First of all, I want to thank our panelists today for this excellent conversation to be. Katie Queen and Nikki Lewis were the curators of the exhibition that we currently have on view at the center, and which has been extended through January with the hope that people will be able to visit in person. This exhibition is viewable, visitable on our website, craftinamerica.org. It's called Here Now, Contemporary Narrative and Form in the Yunomi. And it is paired together with another exhibition called The Humble Legacy. Both shows focus on the Yunomi as a significant form in ceramics and in material culture, and today's discussion will be on that subject. Thank you so much, Jenni Sorkin, for joining us today and bringing your expertise as an art historian to this discussion. And we encourage all of you to share your questions and comments in the chat or Q&A, and they will be addressed towards the end of the conversation. And we're looking forward to exploring this topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Emily.
I'm going to put the screen share up, Jenny, to start the...
And we have to go back.
Okay. And we're at the end.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, everyone. Technical difficulties.
While we go back, we just wanted to say once again that Katie and I have been quarantining together. We've kind of put our families in a pod. So we're together unmasked. Because we're able to do that because we've been dedicated quarantining. So just to kind of clear the air about that before we begin.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining us again. This has been a really exciting curatorial project for us, and we're so thrilled to, start this talk for you today. So as we start, the loaded vessel, Re-Contextualizing the Yunomi. First and foremost, we want to thank Craft in America.
Yes.
Emily Zayden, Alex Miller, Carol Sovian, for giving us the opportunity to curate the show and to extend it, through December. Has just been fantastic.
Yeah, so the show is extended. I think it's through January.
Oh, okay.
And then so, hopefully with the opportunity that people will be able to see it, we'll see how it goes. But it's open. Please check out the catalog on the website. It's very beautiful. So it's really wonderful.
Okay. We want to introduce Jenni Sorkin. Thank you again so much, Jenni, for coming on and doing this talk with us. And just kind of give a little bit of background for Jenni Sorkin. She is an associate professor of art history and architecture at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Sorkin writes and contributes on many topics, including contemporary art, material culture, craft and design, gender and artistic labor, just to name a few. She has much more of extended kind of specialized topics, but we really wanted to focus on those. Her current book project is Art in California. It's a book that she's writing currently. We're excited to see where she goes with that. And her first book that she ever wrote was in 2016, Live Forms, Women's Ceramics and Community. This book, I've given a little bit of content as far as like what the subject is in which she's talking about, which correlates a lot with what she specializes. Other projects that she's worked on, she co-curated with Paul Schemmel at Hauser and Wirth, the Revolution in the Making, abstract sculpture by women from 1947 to 2016. A phenomenal show. It was actually the first show at the Hauser and Wirth here in Los Angeles. It was a great way to kick off that space. She's also been a contributing writer for Leap Before You Look, a anthology basically of Black Mountain College. It's just this huge, amazing book. It's a great book. Working with Helen Molesworth, who's another hero of ours. So again, amazing. And this is just to name a few of the contributions and projects that Jenni has worked on. And I guess we really want to start with just kind of talking about why we asked Jenni to come on.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it was sort of like when we read Live Form and looking at these particular female artists that she focused on, MC Richards, Marguerite Wildenham, and Susan Peterson. And it also looked like our slide like kind of mixed them up, but basically on the left is Marguerite Wildenham, a really amazing potter that came from the Bauhaus legacy, MC Richard, poet and ceramicist, and then Susan Peterson, who sort of brought craft to TV and ushered in much of the Ming movement in California. So reading this book, it filled in a blank spot for Katie and I in our art historical education, where we didn't have a lot of information about mid-century female potters, female artists in general, that was sort of missing from us as female makers, women makers. And so happening upon this book or reading this book created, filled in that blank spot big time. So
yeah, and thanking you for that, you know, connecting those dots for us. Jen. I mean, it was just this light went off, and
it was great.
It means a lot to us. So thank you.
Yeah.
So we really now want to just kind of jump right in and you know, kind of get to the meat of what we're here to talk about, and what is a Yunomi, and kind of giving a little bit of back history for those of you who maybe missed the show or the context of it. The Yunomi is a drinking vessel that is really originates in Japan. It's cylindrical in shape and has a very tiny kind of hidden foot generally in the piece. They're always taller than they are wide, and they are not precious. Nikki and I like to call them cupboard cups. And it's the everyday pieces. They're not, you know, supposed to, you know, be seen as precious in any context. Over to the right in this slide that we're giving you, this is an image I just basically on social media, I typed in Yunomi, and over 32,000 images popped up. And I just wanted to kind of just throw that in there, and about how Yunomis have kind of taken off in the last 10, 15 years.
As a form that artists want to make or potters want to make. And I think that it's such an intriguing form for us because it really is a form that you can use as a sketch for larger forms. It's a form that we like to share amongst each other. We've talked about this, and it's been talked about in other lectures as well. So there's this, you know, sort of mystique around it. But what Katie and I really liked was the idea of it being the everyday cupboard cup, and also the idea of the pairing too.
Oh yeah, right. So that's where we go to here. So talk a little bit about that, Nick.
So the Myoto or married pair of Yunomi traditionally have been given as wedding gifts to newlywed couples in Japanese culture. And one is sometimes bigger than the other, oftentimes. This is a pair of Myoto Yunomi from Shoji Hamada. And I know that they're basically simple forms, and we actually have a pair here. I have collected them myself. I didn't even know until we started to research them. So when Katie and I
before you go ahead, the one's smaller and one's larger to represent male and female. So don't forget that point,
No,
right?
I was going to go into that. But so exactly. But one represents the male, one represents the female traditionally. And so when Katie and I were thinking about the show, putting this exhibition together, when we researched the meaning of the married pair with the sizing and the applied gender, it kind of opened us up to like really playing with those ideas. What does that mean? You know, that dichotomy of gender, and also just, you know, reinterpretation of the Yunomi sort of from an American or Western point of view. So
right. So that's kind of like a recap of the exhibition, the ideas behind the show, and really, so for today, talking about the loaded vessel, the recontextualizing of American culture, kind of absorbing other cultures, or the lack thereof. So Jenny, we really wanted to kind of like start the conversation with you to talk a little bit about why we think that Western culture elevates and romanticizes objects from other cultures, specifically Japan. Right.
Do you want to put me back on the?
Yeah.
Cool. There I am.
Right.
Nice PowerPoint. Thank you. I think that the mid-century moment that Yunomi and also Japanese making is so influential to potters in the United States because of this tradition of World War II veterans coming back and going to school during the boom in ceramics and in all craft and art programs that happens in the early post-war period when there's a tremendous amount of growth. And all of these veterans, many of them are first generation college students, they're from working class backgrounds, and they're being purposefully shuttled into art programs specifically and into craft because it's a manual skill. And so there's already a kind of diminishing of the idea of mind versus body, or sort of hand versus mind, in that working class veterans are considered, you know, they shouldn't go into the mindful disciplines, they should go into the hand-based disciplines. And so ceramics already counts as a hand-based discipline, but with them, they bring in their experiences abroad. And many veterans were, you know, passed through England, or they were stationed in the Philippines, or they, you know, they visited or were on a base in Japan, and they became very excited by and sort of, you know, their eyes were open to this so-called exotic Japanese culture that valued different traditions and treated beauty as a kind of everyday value system and a kind of aesthetic in which all people could participate in, you know, having beautiful objects in one's home. And so I think that that's really where we get this Japanese tradition or through line in ceramics. And I don't know that we've gotten rid of it yet. I think we're sort of still there's a kind of romanticization on the part, particularly I think by functional potters, who are still working often out of a Japanese tradition. But, you know, we also know that Americans don't, for the most part, drink out of, you know, small, you know, 8 ounce or less cups. You know, particularly in our big gulp culture. Yeah. And so I think that there's a real disconnect in terms of making objects that people might put on their mantle and making objects in states where people might use them, and what that, you know, what the difference is and how that skews. And, you know, who drinks tea versus who drinks coffee, and, you know, all of those considerations. So for me, it's very interesting to think about these Yunomi vessels and think about which ones are actually going to be much more sculptural versus actually functional.
Yeah, no, definitely. That was a great answer. When you started talking, it made me start to think a little bit about in live forms where didn't also a lot of the men coming back from war, also it was like rehabilitation that they were like put into ceramics. Can you talk a little bit about that at all? Yeah.
Yeah, so there is a kind of therapeutic tradition of using ceramics in particular, but also all the crafts as a kind of, it starts actually in World War I. It starts in England, and it comes and carries over through Red Cross efforts, through museum efforts. The Museum of Modern Art in New York had a big craft program on the premises in terms of training veterans. It's also where Goodwill Industries, which we think of as largely a thrift shop now, Goodwill, where we go and get cool, you know, clothes, but and, you know, tchotchkes for our home. But Goodwill actually had a huge therapeutic craft program as a way to rehabilitate battle-shocked soldiers. And battle shock was the mid-century term for what we would today call PTSD. And that teaching ceramics in particular and learning to throw vessels on a wheel, and the kind of rotation of the wheel and the meditative qualities of that was considered therapeutic, regardless of if you produced really beautiful objects. It was about quieting the mind in some way. And so that was a way for veterans to work through trauma in an era where there was no active therapy, where it perhaps wasn't considered culturally masculine to talk about your problems. And if we look to sort of the fine arts of that era, we see that, you know, the ravages of drink is what kills, you know, about half the abstract expressionists. And this was also a sense of, some of them were veterans, that people were drinking or, you know, working out their trauma in these ways, that because there was not psychotherapy at the time in a big way. There was some Freudian psychoanalysis, people were doing that, but generally that was kind of elite, and that was based in New York. And for most of the country, young men didn't have access to that, and maybe didn't have access to their feelings. And so working with their hands became a kind of transmission point for thinking about how you might engage emotionally with some of your issues post-war.
Of course.
Yeah, and then also through that, you have this sort of Buddhist meditative mindset that might have carried over a little bit, through World War II and the mingling of these cultures. And so I could see how it's a way that, especially in ceramics, that expression kind of came through, with the Mingei, with the appreciation for Japanese ceramics, and wanting to really make those forms, or sort of experience, those forms that felt pretty foreign, or very, very non-Western, so.
Well, and we might just want to say that Mingei is also a kind of homage to the anonymous artisan or the anonymous potter, that anybody can partake in that work. It's not a signed pot. Hamada, who you showed earlier, expressly didn't sign his work as a way to identify with the Mingei potter, or the kind of humble artisan rural potter of Japan. And yet many of the Japanese potters like Hamada that come to the United States in the early, like in the 50s, they are trained people. They have training. They are misunderstood as themselves Mingei, but they were not really Mingei. They too were romanticizing the Mingei.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of, also I think the idea that Mingei and Zen get mixed up a lot for Americans, in terms of Zen being a kind of Buddhist practice, and thinking that this meditative quality of the wheel is itself Zen, because we have a kind of boom culture of Zen populism in the 50s and 60s, where people start reading about Zen, or Zen in the motorcycle, or there's all these books and sort of publications that start circulating around Zen, and there's artists very interested in Zen at that moment. And it is definitely floating in the air. And I think it's just Americans with our utter sense of individualism have a really hard time understanding how to detach or divorce from one's ego entirely. Because, I mean, that's also the hard part in the field of ceramics, is that it has been about the individual maker, and sort of the world building that happens in the culture of your own studio space, or your own pottery. If you have a bunch of assistants working alongside you, it's like you've built this little world and people are invited into it. And when people come to buy your objects, they leave with a piece of you, but they're also invited into your world and then depart from your world, but retain that essence of your sensibility, your aesthetic in your work, to the point of having a kind of signature style, which is actually the antithesis of Mingei.
Exactly.
The exact antithesis of Mingei. So it was never gonna
Materialize.
Work. It was never gonna happen. It just was
a point of departure.
Yeah.
Really. I mean, something to be inspired by, but
Mm-hmm.
it didn't.
So can I ask the two of you a question, which is that, can you talk a little bit about, because you pointed out that Yunomi had this kind of heteronormativity built into it, in terms of being, maybe gifted as a set of marriage vessels, and it's male female. I'm certain that you've included artists who are working and pushing against that convention actively. What does it mean to sort of refashion or work with this traditional form, but shake it up a bit and reinterpret it in terms of being this very contemporary set of possibilities?
I mean, I think that for us, when we started to do our research into this, and then to think about what artists we would plug in, and to reach out, because we invited all of the artists to be in this exhibition. It was like a set assignment, and the people that were selected, we're already working so specifically. Their work is so narrative based already.
A lot of them were narrative, and not all of them, but some of them were cup makers, but not all of them. So it wasn't like it was an assignment. It wasn't like work was already made and we selected it, but more along the lines of we felt like we found artists who had a specific voice that,
yeah, I mean, which takes
Yeah.
us to, you know, to those specific artists, you know, like, you know, Leslie Mcnelly, who is Canadian based, and you know, her work in particular, you know, she's really obsessed with this idea of surface and architecture and like found space. And so, you know, kind of
Landscape,
in
yeah.
landscape, and really kind of taking it, you know, so it's not anonymous in her work. Kevin Snipe, his work is really about, you know, otherness and his ideas of who himself, and Candace Meth as well. You know, we really wanted to select artists that really could move away from this whole idea of the anonymous into, you know, this idea of pairing of the male and female, and to turn it, kind of flip it on its head, and to turn it in about their own individual journey or
like
ideas.
like total reinterpretation of those gender normative themes, and just like social themes. So you have Kevin Snipes, who, you know, talks about otherness in his work, and each panel represents another facet of the other for him, but they're all one. And then Candace Meth, you have, you know, at least with this form, I think it's like, you know, it's very gender, but the masculine and the feminine, but she wanted to kind of have it be like feelings of dominance, right?
Yeah, well, it's dominance and submission. But
Yeah,
I mean, so yeah, but all of the artists that we've selected for this show, you know, their work is so much about their own individual voice, so much about their own individual work ideas, that I think that, again, going back to this whole notion and idea of using the Yunomi or even using the anonymous potter, it's just not even possible. You know, like we have moved so far away from that, like these ideas of appropriation and kind of romanticizing has definitely shifted, and I think that we have really kind of moved into a direction of reinterpretation. So we've been inspired by these objects, right? So ceramic artists are using these Yunomis, they're using these tea bowls or the tea bowl ceremony as a point of departure, and it's kind of taking us in a different direction, versus the you know, the ceramic artists of the mid-century,
like more
after
the
World War
mid-century,
II.
after World War II. So
and really, can I add also that Ming has largely now, it was initially about the idea of the anonymous sort of good country potter, rural maker who would make these, you know, what you're calling cupboard cups that you could find in any small town or buy anywhere. It was transmitted here and largely has become known as folk pottery or folk artwork. And so there was actually a museum that was opened in 1972 that still exists today, called the Ming Museum, devoted to worldwide folk traditions, by a mid-century trained potter named Martha Longnecker, who taught for many years at San Diego State University. And this was really her life's work to sort of devote an institutional space in San Diego to cultures worldwide that privileged self-trained folk craftspeople, artisans, toy makers, doll makers, any kind of traditions that had been largely overlooked by maybe modern art museums. And so that space does exist today.
Yeah.
I mean, a question about Ming, so I just wanted to.
No, that's great. I mean, and so to continue like kind of our conversation about, you know, that mid-century kind of romanticism and appropriation and shifting it into that reinterpretation, we really want to get a little bit of like the female voice, you know, because we're really talking a lot about, you know, the popularizing of ceramic arts and crafts that are happening after World War II. You know, maybe kind of touch in with us a little bit about, you know, where are women in the movement of makers during this period to now?
Well, I make the argument in my book that women are overlooked and forgotten about and sort of in the background, and are often working or forced to work in supportive roles in terms of being wives, doing the background work for many artist husbands, like typing their letters, but also doing the kind of organizational, structural work that's really hard and difficult, like writing curriculum and founding programs and teaching and doing the kind of hard institutional labor, particularly because women in ceramics were never going to get jobs in painting and sculpture. It was very hard mid-century to be a practicing professional painter or sculptor. Women were really barred from those fields, and craft became a kind of open back door for them to do this kind of work. And so that's one of the major arguments in my book about how these women came to ceramics, and they all came from being trained as in other disciplines, largely painting and sculpture, but largely painting, which was, you know, is the kind of go-to discipline, and made conscious choices to become ceramic artists, to become functional potters. Marguerite Wildenham is maybe the only exception to that, where she had an entire sort of European Bauhaus education.
Right. She rejected the Ming. I mean,
she did reject the Ming, and she also rejected the American school system, because the way she was able to come to the United States is that she had a visa to teach at the California College of Arts and Crafts in Oakland. And she spent 2 years teaching there and hated every minute of it, because she felt that Americans were too soft on their students and that they weren't rigorous enough, and instead moved to Northern California in Guerneville and founded her own pottery called Pond Farm, where for 30 years she trained students in this Bauhaus curriculum that was incredibly hardcore in terms of—
and wrestled with them, didn't she?
Yeah, sometimes. But I think the major thing that she transmitted, and this is also the argument in the chapter about her, is process. She really pushed process and form and learning skill building over the final object, which is the kind of antithesis of what you do in a ceramics class even today, where students wouldn't dream of leaving at the end of the semester without a bunch of objects that they had made and could take home and gift to people or use. And she didn't let any of her students at the end of 12 weeks working 8 hours a day leave with anything, because nobody fired anything. Because all the clay was broken back down. She would cut through the pots with a wire cutter and tell you what was wrong with the pot. And it was about sort of deconstructing the pot and also taking apart the American student ego simultaneously.
You know, I wanted not to interject, but we interviewed quite a few of her students for a project that we had done. And, you know, a lot of them had said, like, yeah, she wanted to teach us, like, you know, not to keep our stuff, but at the same time, she was too cheap. She, like, wanted to break it down so she could re-wedge it and have more students use the clay. Yeah. So I think it's this interesting kind of, like, interpretation, you know, of how people are seeing it in conjunction with, you know, her philosophies and ideas. But yeah, no, I totally agreed. She was definitely an important voice. But I mean, but as far as now, you know, like when we think about a lot, you know, because our show in particular, we kind of talked about this before the talk, there is a lot of women in this show, right? And you know, intentionally, not unintentionally. I mean, we really wanted to bring people to the table with this narrative and this idea. And there's actually, you know, a lot of makers who are beginning to get some recognition in the ceramic arts who are female.
Yeah, who are female and have been for a really long time. But definitely you have to sort of brand yourself, which is in direct contrast to any of that, you know, mid-century Mingayism, you know, that, you know, golden era, I guess, if you will, of that, you know, that time period, that transcendence is like, you know, it's gone the way of social media, Instagram. And right now in our big social movement in this, you know, pandemic that we're in, craft, I'm sure right now is going to get redefined in very radical ways. So, and that's a really interesting conversation too.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, Jenny?
Well, I guess I just want to respond to the first part of that, which is that we've historically, ceramics history has privileged male potters, as you pointed out, and also male sculptors. So, you know, Peter Voulkos is maybe the largest name in American ceramics, and part of the reason I set out to write about these three women who are often considered and denigrated as minor artists in the field. I really wanted to examine that concept of what's major and what's minor, and really sort of undo those associations we have about what constitutes a contribution in our field. You know, is it actually a bigger contribution to set up a major program and train students, even if you don't get credit for it and people don't know your name and your work is not featured at MoMA? Or is it, you know, important that you made bronze sculpture for the last 10 years of your career like Volkas did? And all of these women that I write about circulate in a male-dominated field in places where they're often not welcomed, or they're challenged, or they, by contrast, are challenging the men in the field to work differently, be different, and you know, function differently. And I don't think that that challenge was welcomed by mid-century men. And you know, this field has still, I find it kind of crazy that we have tons of arts administrators in the nonprofit world who are largely women, and that this field is run by women, and you still see major one-person shows being given over to men, you know, to white men. And I think that that's a kind of unconscious bias that's inherited from the mid-century, where women are still willing to work on behalf of of men more than they are willing to work on behalf of women, because they've been trained to serve in that way. And that it's a kind of, you know, wholehearted bias historically in art history. And art history is one of the problems of this, is that, you know, you're trained to think that the great people, the great heroic artists are men, and they're not. And so to undo that through, you know, good research and good, you know, thinking and looking, I think is really key here. And I think it's important that you're trying to also take apart what a Yunomi is, and how that might, how this historic object, or this, you know, has been valued or received, and then what we might do to take apart or deconstruct that object, and have, you know, offer it to contemporary artists to remake that in their own vision.
Right. To use it as a platform, as a jumping off point to talk about something on a much more, you know, complex and, you know, social, political, economical, you know, issue.
Yeah.
And that's the problem also, is that ceramics has sort of been behind in terms of coming late to the game about thinking about diversity, and thinking about race, and thinking about gender, and thinking about sexuality, and how this field might diversify from the inside versus just the pressure of exterior pressures forcing it to. Like, the field itself has to want it.
No, definitely.
Yeah. And then, you know, also in light of, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement right now, you know, and the pandemic, you know, and
Me Too.
Me Too, and these big social movements that are, you know, upon us at this moment. And also, like, current generations, like Katie and I were talking about millennials and Gen Z, you know, just sort of like shedding a lot of the baggage, you know, of previous generations that have kind of come forward. Like Katie and I are still doing it from our education, where we're still shedding some of the baggage from our, you know, very traditional, you know, very form first education. And which was really, you know,
which is important.
Well, it was,
yeah.
you know, we got, you know, it was amazing, but it's really interesting when you start picking it apart and start, you know, looking into, you know, the culture of things. So
Also to realize that form itself is political.
Yeah.
You can't just escape and put your head in the sand, and, you know, just because you want to throw pots doesn't mean that it's not a politicized thing to do that, and decide to do that, and figure out what it means socially and culturally to make functional pots at a time when there are functional potters who have politicized their work. So if we're looking, for instance, at like Aaron Toole, who really does pacifist work with his cups, and he gives them away, or Ayumi Horia, who has made cups for democracy, and, you know, done a lot of fundraisers with functional vessels. And to see these examples in our field as important examples of making a kind of social awareness platform through functional pottery.
Right. Well, because the functional pottery becomes the invitation in, right? Like everybody has to eat and drink off of plates. And so it becomes this really great platform that people who maybe feel intimidated by the more fine art world, it is opening doors to that concept. So it's
because
good.
you can also take the image and place it like with the function, you know, and then it becomes this intimate endeavor in a lot of ways. You know, Aaron O'Toole's work, you know, does he call them Yunomi? I don't know. I think they're cups, you know, but they're definitely have, you know, a lot of narrative within them. You know, one of our artists, Shoko Teriyama, you know,
actually, let me show that image.
It's so different from,
Show us the image, and then should we open this to questions?
Yeah,
that would be great. Yes.
You know, as a Japanese artist who inscribes her name, you know, and very individualizes her pieces very strongly.
There it is.
Right there, Shoko. You know, it's such a departure from that classic, you know, anonymous potter, you know, so.
I mean, that, you know, just ending it by basically saying like, you know, Menge in its entirety, you know, could it exist even still today? You know, like, could it reemerge? And that's, you know, that's to be determined, you know, but
yeah, or some sort of version of it. Right. So,
but in any case,
but
should we open it up for some questions?
Yeah, I think we're getting some in the chat. Oh, that's Emily. Never mind.
Okay.
Does anybody have any questions or comments? We have this nice big audience. Thank you all for being here.
Yeah, no kidding. Let's see.
Hi, I'm rejoining you. I think the conversation of women, you make a lot of very interesting and important points, particularly about the founding of the Ming movement from the 1920s into the mid 20th century. And that being founded by men, both Japanese and British, Bernard Leach, and the artists in Japan was predominantly founded by men, but interestingly, it was transmitted in many cases, particularly on the West Coast, by women. So again, kind of the recognition that women have played this more behind the scenes role in all of this movement and all of this evolution of ceramics as an artistic medium. In particular, Susan Peterson and Martha Longnecker, who you had mentioned before. Yeah, and I wonder if there's any other issues of gender in terms of making now that maybe you want to talk about through the specific examples of objects in this show and themes that these artists have touched on. And we'll continue seeing if questions come in.
Yeah, what I think is kind of interesting is that, you know, several of the artists knew what a Yunomi was, but most of them, majority of them, did not know what a Myoto Yunomi was. Like, we didn't know either. So, or we, you know, we had seen two cups together. So actually having the dialogue with those artists about that gendered pair of Yunomi and how they were given, it really wasn't, they just took with it immediately. Like, when we talked to these artists, they were like, oh yeah, I've got ideas. I know exactly what I want to do. It was, you know, a really good moment, I think, for a lot of them to kind of make work that they wasn't necessarily on their radar, you know, to begin with.
Yeah. I mean, but I don't know. I mean, as far as like them as women, I mean, I don't think anybody really kind of came forward with like this like feminist stance or kind of platform. I think it was really a lot of them, you know, like Ashley Bevington, you know, she's approaching the work really kind of talking about class and about class expectation and about how, you know, she chose to step away from, you know, she was like, at this point I should be married with like 3 kids, like living in rural America with like, you know, breeding dogs and shooting guns in the woods, and she took this academic, you know, she went in this other direction, right? And so for her, even though her work isn't necessarily out blatantly speaking about that, there is a certain amount of like feminist undertones of like her taking a stance to let her her education, letting her passions or ambitions, foreshadow,
Yeah. So
stereotypical kind of norms of
Yeah.
female roles.
But even that amount of content is really antithetical to, if we think about mid-century form, shape, color, the fact that we even put that content is now not only acceptable but expected, that regardless of how functional your work is, it should have, the expectation, I think, is that it should have some content to it, that you've got to have some kind of conceptual bend to your work to be a working craft artist today.
Right. And I think that that's a good point, Jenny, in the sense that like majority of the work that is in our show is not functional. Leslie Mcnelly. Oh, my work is carrying my child. Yeah, Mcnelly. Yes, exactly. So, and so Mcnelly, I mean, she's speaking up for herself right now. Leslie is, her pieces in the show, those are more, they have these dry kind of crusted exteriors. So they become much more this like mantra, this symbolism about, her putting text into her pieces and then being like put up against a mirror to see these mantras to empower her own daughter and her relationship in a male dominated world, as she's saying in the chat, but those pieces that are in the show aren't ideally functional. Neither are the pieces. I mean, definitely not Ashley's work as well.
Delicate.
Yeah, and same thing goes for Candace Meth. Like she wants them to be functional in theory. They want to hold the idea of functionality, but are they actually going to be used? Not so much.
Yeah, and just another thing on that is that when we talked to those artists, the work was highly personal. So, and there wasn't, I don't feel like there was a lot of broad concept, with a lot of the artists. Like they really sort of internalized the work that they were making and the concept of those Yunomi, maybe because it was, such an assignment in a sense. So it was very personal. So it says like, can you talk more about other women potters?
I'm happy to answer that. Okay, so Karen Rushfield is asking, can you talk more about women potters, their training, and did they ever recognize that their roles were being subsumed by the men in their personal and professional lives? I think it's really complex to talk about mid-century women. It's a pre-feminist era in which women artists were caught in a real conundrum of they couldn't self-acknowledge that they were being discriminated against because their whole worlds were male, and they had to often be one of the boys in order to succeed or get anywhere. Only Susan Peterson, out of the three women that are the case studies in my book, had children. It was a conscious choice at mid-century not to have a child, and if you did have a child, there was often your career wasn't going to be possible in many ways. And I think that repeats itself in the 60s. I think it continues in the 70s. And the choice changes for 70s women, for instance, when women would, accidentally get pregnant and there was the possibility of abortion. There was a possibility of birth control, that all of that opened up space for women to make choices about their own bodies and whether or not they chose to raise children or not, or even reproduce. And so I think that's really important to think about how women's, we cannot divorce the social context of women's artistic practices in the mid 20th century and even into the present. And somebody mentioned Laura Andresen. Laura Andresen was an out lesbian at a time when that was really looked down upon, and she had a full-time teaching position at UCLA, but her partner was a watercolorist, and there's almost no information about her. I found one obituary about her partner, who was named Pauline Blank. Another very famous potter who didn't consider herself to be, or was not ever out as a lesbian, was Frances Senska, who was Peter Volkas's teacher, and established the art department at Montana State with her partner named Jessie. I just can't think of the last name at the moment, but she was a printmaker. They lived together for half a century. They were a couple, but they were an unacknowledged, it was not acknowledged that they were together. They were called friends. That's what the mid-century term was. How's your friend? And Frances retired early to care for her partner through cancer. And what was really amazing was, and this is very moving to me, the state of Montana awarded them a dual Medal of Honor.
I love that.
For their, contribution to the state. But again, that's not an acknowledged gay partnership. That's just a kind of internalized one that everybody knows it is, but it's different than actual, acknowledgement of, look at these amazing lesbians who were at the helm of this rough and tumble cow town in Montana, in Bozeman, starting in 1940.
I think that you should also probably put in there Karen Carnes and her partner.
Yes.
In the same sense that, and I think it's generational as well. I think that it's a very personal, something that, yes, they lived together, they lived in the same spaces, they each have their own, rooms, so on and so forth. And it was never something that they verbalized or they labeled, but I don't think it was ever a secret. It was just more kind of just untalked about.
Well, it wasn't talked about, and somebody's telling us that, remember that our generation would have had even more baggage if it wasn't for the civil rights movement, gay rights movement, the sexual revolution, and much more. Absolutely. We absolutely acknowledge that all of these women and movements, social movements, come before and make possible the ability to be out now, the ability to have a dialogue and discourse in which you don't have to hide your sexuality in your artistic practice, or that you don't have to hide your race, or that if you decide to not acknowledge it. So somebody asked about BIPOC artists. Kevin Snopes is an African-American artist, but you wouldn't necessarily know that by looking at the work. You may or may not. He's making sort of African-American featured figures, but it's not necessarily, it's kind of subtle. So I think that it's not, one doesn't always have to reveal what their vantage point is or point of view, that there's the choice now to decide whether or not you're going to engage in an active way around race and around self-representation. And somebody who does that, I think really well is Robert Lugo, who's based in Philadelphia, who makes work specifically about race and representation coming from a disadvantaged Puerto Rican working class family, and that's and that's what about.
We should also mention Jeff Astrike in terms of identity, who uses imagery and symbolism in his work.
Yeah, do you want to kind of remark on that, Nikki?
Well, just when in interviews with Jeff, I've looked at his work, we've looked at his work for years, held it, used it, have admired it until I actually interviewed him. I didn't realize that the symbolism within his work, there's many features with them that talk about, the triangular patches that were put on gay people during the Nazi, during the Nazi occupation. And that features really prominently in his work. Also just little bits and doodads, as he calls them, that are actually press molds of antidepressants. And, just sort of his identity as a, queer potter,
and the red heels,
and and his high heels, because he loves high heels, and it's not a secret. So,
Jenny's making a point where it doesn't have to be overtly over the top.
It's not overt.
It's still embedded in the work, and it's been there for a very long time. And people who are of because Jeff is of a little bit older generation, he's not blatantly bringing this stuff forward. It's been there, but it wasn't really talked about till he was asked.
But what's really interesting about Kevin Snipes too is that now that the dialogue is really to the surface with Black Lives Matter, there's a really deep investigation and talking about like the work in a really open sort of way, that we're able to do maybe now, or that we can venture into, that hasn't been as much of a possibility or has met a lot of resistance in the past.
So. And that's something that he's addressing in his work as of now. When we interviewed him, he's intentionally moved away from rural America. He's intentionally living in Philadelphia. He wants to diversify himself so that he can be engaged, you know? So,
I
yeah,
like looking at the chat. Everybody's talking to each other back and forth. It's kind of fun.
Can we say one thing about the, actually, that was a really good point, Katie, about rural versus urban. And I think that that's a real tension in our field. And it's an interesting one because
the ceramic field, yes.
Yes, in the ceramic field, because there's so much rural craft that's romanticized, but in fact, you do often have to be in an urban environment to train. Whether or not you stay there is a different thing, but most people who, train professionally come to some sort of urban environment in which to get craft training and skill building. There's very few people, although it does still exist, but hardly, very few people do the kind of, I don't know.
However, most of the craft specific schools are actually rural. So Penland, Pilchuck, Berea, and so on are actually not in
But
rural.
you're pointing out non-degreed programs for the most part, except Berea. Those are not degree programs. You can't get a degree at Penland. You can't get a degree at Pilchuck. Those are summer craft. Those are craft residencies and programs. They're not.
Yeah,
I'm talking about like if you want a degree, there were many people who came to study weaving at UCLA. They had an amazing program throughout, until the 70s. There were people still go to, there's not that many places to go study glass blowing in this country because a lot of the glass blowing programs have been shuttered, and California still has numerous glass programs simply because you can put them outside. And put a big awning over it, and it's a little safer that way. I think that's something to think about in our post-COVID moment, how California might get back to craft quicker because there's so many outdoor facilities for ceramics that are kind of adjacent to the art building, and the kilns fire outside on a patio or something, or you can mix your clay or your glaze chemistries outside because there was never an indoor space for it to begin with because nobody could afford the proper ventilation.
I think Emily's making an interesting point though, that a lot of the craft centers like Penland, there's the Worcester Center for Crafts, there's the like Arrowmount, like all of these all of these centers, in Alfred as well. Well, Alfred's a university, but
it's pretty rural.
But it's rural. But talking more about the craft centers in particular, people go there for short stints of time, right, to do workshops. So that is, or they do residencies. But people are not getting residencies at those institutions just out of the blue. Like they've already received degrees, usually at an institution, before they become residents there. So even though they are separated, there is a certain amount of feed in from urban spaces that feed into those rural institutions.
Which is also about why people want to go like from New York to, people want to get the hell out of New York City in the summer and go up to Haystack. It's beautiful and you get to be on the ocean. It's like,
don't you want to get out of LA right now? I would.
So, there's that. And I feel like in some ways, a lot of these middle of the country residencies and places, like even the Kansas City Art Institute, you just sort of wonder, there's a lot of clay, physical clay in the Midwest, so it's really easy and accessible to get to clay, so I think
actually, there's a really good question or comment about COVID. How has COVID from Joan, how has COVID hastened acceptance of craft? I think that's a great point. I think it probably many more people are this makes people run back to their studios, right, to do work in isolation by oneself. Instead of doing social practice work where you're trying to summon or gather great and inspire lots of people to do things and participate, it's ceramics is the perfect studio space for one. Particularly if you have a little electric kiln you can fire with. What?
I said, or a gas kiln.
Yeah, or a gas kiln, but you know what I'm saying. That there's something to the idea of, self-isolating in one studio space that in many ways the field has moved away from and rejected, is now in full circle embraced because of COVID. because we're being encouraged to self-isolate and to do work that you can do safely by yourself. Craft is perfect for that.
More in line with like the singular studio artist, like a painter, photographer, or something like that, whereas ceramics has really been a lot about shared community, you know? So now we're trying to figure it all out. But I think that so many people are turning towards it like as a weird comfort. As my friend Robert Miller likes to say, ceramics is the new yoga, you know? So, you know, it's, you know, in the time of COVID, it's really interesting. And I think it's kind of interesting too with the social movement of how the spotlight has really been shined on a lot of, you know, different, you know, cultural makers, you know, African-American makers and, you know, BIPOC makers. So
I wonder what you all think of the significance of the cup in this time, and if there's anything that's shifting either formally or in terms of content or approach. I mean, it's the object that most of us are probably touching the most each day.
mm-hmm.
What does that mean? How does it change?
Clay's the new yoga, yeah.
Clay's the new yoga. Online ceramics classes with clay kits provided has exploded enrollment. You mean, are you talking about the institution, like teaching institutions? Or are you talking about the pottery studios that are, you know, more, I guess, hobbyist based? Because they've
enrollment at Otis, but I think also, I think that this is a larger point though about access, that online access makes things more accessible if you happen to own a computer, if you own a smartphone, if you have access to Zoom, which we know many first generation college students, many students of color don't, that it's really hard to get access. And I think I just want to applaud the two of you for, you teach in LA community colleges. Your classrooms are full of first generation college students. They are largely non-white working class kids who have never been exposed to clay, who have never gone to museums, who are not brought up in this world or not given artistic enrichment in their public schools. And you're at the front lines of introducing them to a field that historically didn't include them.
Thank you for acknowledging that, Jenny.
Yeah,
thank you.
And I know that I have several students that are on this webinar right now. And I tell them all the time when I meet them how proud of them I am when we get on the Zoom together. It's one of the first things I always say. So yeah, I you know, I kind of lost my train of thought because I got a little emotional about my.
Say something about, I mean, could you just, I guess, say something about what it means to train students and introduce them to clay and make this an incredibly, it's a democratic material, but its history is not so democratic in many ways. And what does it mean to kind of do that hard work on the ground?
I mean, I can speak for myself in regards that, like, I don't want to be anywhere else. I mean, I love to teach the students that I have, the demographic that I have. It's like my classroom is so diverse between ages and ethnicities and socioeconomic backgrounds, people coming back to school, people who have, you know, are DACA students, people who are international students. And I feel like going to the place of when we talk about the diversity within ceramics, it's really lagging. And I think it's important that we get to be that part of that generation, next generation of ceramic artists that show more diversity, because we are introducing these students and giving them a pathway into this passion that we have.
Yeah.
And I like to be part of that, and it's fantastic.
I'd like to be part of it too, and try and reflect, you know, like them back in the work that they're making. So at least in my school, we've been able to hand out portable pottery wheels to our students to have them be able to make work, you know, and they're really brave to pick them up and to try and carve out a space in their homes to be able to do it. But it's still actually really difficult because that becomes a class issue in some ways, because if a lot of them are, you know, in sharing like housing with their families, where are they going to be able to make this work? And it's something that I've thought about greatly, you know, with this. So
But that was funny. Joan just said, firing can still happen in private studios.
Yeah.
COVID can't survive in kilns. That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
I think we're gonna come to
Maybe that's a good place to end.
Yeah,
COVID can't survive kilns. That's like a great catchphrase.
I think the cups that you've been discussing today and that are in the exhibition, which we hope everybody will view on the website and get more in-depth understanding of these objects, really speaks to this idea of empowerment that has been themed throughout your conversation, and that's what's represented within those objects. And I think it really shows the continuity and the continuum of the approach to ceramics that began with Ming, that continued with Bernard Leach, and this humble legacy, and that artists have now taken in this new direction. So thank you so much for bringing this understanding to these objects. Thank you to the three of you for your insights and all of your wisdom. Please, we encourage everybody from the audience, if there's additional questions or comments that you weren't able to share today in the chat, you are welcome to send them to center@craftinamerica.org, and we'll put you in touch with Jenni, Katie, or Nikki. And thank you again for everybody who attended.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emily, for hosting us.
Yeah, thank you, Emily.
Okay. And thank you, Craft in America. Thank you, Jenni. So.
Thank you, both of you, for inviting me, and thank you, Craft in America, for sponsoring this.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Stay healthy.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Yes,
Okay.
well.
Bye.